All right. Thank you all for coming. This is a lot of fun. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the playground director at Fuel, which is kind of a weird gig for me. I've never worked at an agency before. I come from a much more traditional engineering background. I've done a lot of hardware, a lot of software, and over the years, more and more product design, more work on products, which is what I really want to talk about today. So Fuel is a digital agency, and we've got some really interesting clients and global brands. We've got a focus on youth and a focus on digital experiences, so interactive media, games, mobile development, websites, stuff like that. Our head office is in Ottawa, where it was founded. We've got about 150 people there, and another office in LA, where all the bigwigs live. And beyond digital marketing, Fuel has a production company as well, and probably the coolest thing that we've done is this documentary, which is on Netflix now and well worth a watch, about the E.T. game that Atari made back in the 80s and then buried in the desert in Arizona in a landfill. So they went and dug it up, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it was only just over 30 years ago, but this is already an archaeological expedition. Which gives you an idea how fast things go now, you know? And it's actually quite a poignant film because they had the original developer, you know, and this is widely criticized as being the worst video game of all time. But he was actually a very nice guy and very gifted developer, so well worth a watch up on Netflix. Beyond all that, they brought me in about 7 months ago to lead what they call the Playground. And Playground is an interesting experiment. More and more digital agencies are doing this. We make stuff. So I'm the tame geek that they brought in, and I know how a soldering iron works, and I know how computers work. And they have me sort of bridging the digital stuff that Fuel has done for years and that they're very good at with physical spaces, installations, augmented toys, all kinds of interesting stuff like that. I keep an eye on new technologies, keep an eye on the horizon to see what's coming. What's going to be relevant in a year or two so that when it does drop, we're ready for it. And we think a lot about how we can help companies create great experiences for their customers that drive engagement and build their brand. We're also set up as a rapid prototyping shop. I still don't have a laser cutter, but it's on my list. But we've got a lot of other gear. We'd like to be in a position to be able to build something. If someone comes to us with an idea, we want to be able to build it really quickly, at least a rough prototype. When you're pitching big ideas to traditional companies, big brands like Coke and McDonald's, people like that, if you come with a slide deck, they are ready for you. They know how these things work. Their whole machinery is built around this kind of pitch. And they're very conservative. They're very cautious. And if you come to them with a big idea, there's something, someone described this, and I think this is a wonderful phrase, the chasm of how that you have to cross. Well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to do this? I don't know. That seems a little weird. It's hard to get through that unless you bring a working prototype, put it on the table, and let them play with it. It helps them get over their suspension of disbelief. It helps them buy into your story and believe in this thing, which is great because then you get to do really good things, really non-traditional things that are very, very effective. So we're always, this is one of my favorite pictures from the internet ever. I came across this a couple of years ago, and it really was the inspiration for this talk. And this is a talk I've wanted to give for a long time. So why? Why indeed? There's a problem in a lot of product design, and the problem is that we are over-applying technology to these things. This is driven by older ways of thinking, and it leads to kind of crappy products that don't make any sense. We put Twitter on a touchscreen and a fridge because we finally could after all these years. You know, at a price point that's, you know, like just a dream. All of those years we suffered through without it on our fridges, and now we can do it. Because it's finally possible. And this was the old formula for success. In engineering companies, especially in technical products, if you were the first one to do something, you won. And it was just, you know, but it completely ignores what people actually do. In the kitchen, I might want Twitter in the kitchen, but I've got it in my pocket on my phone. I've got it on the tablet that I've got the recipes on that I'm cooking. I don't need to stand in front of my fridge with the door closed, tapping on the thing like that. So the problem is that sometimes the old ways still work, and it can lead us into confusion. BlackBerry was huge. BlackBerry put email in your pocket. And it was a long time ago, and it's something that we absolutely take for granted now. But it was a really big deal. And it was revolutionary because it had never been done. And this sort of thing still works if you're way out on the cutting edge of what's just barely possible. I think VR and AR are there right now. But it's sort of like that old story about the dancing dog. It's not that he does it particularly well, it's that he can do it at all. But once technology has been sorted out, once we understand it, once it's become easy and it's popularized and it's commoditized, you really need to take a different approach. It's not enough to do it just because you can, because you're likely to make something stupid and crappy. I suspect that this is an example of such a product. This is called the egg minder. Can you guess what it does? It keeps track of your eggs. It's an egg crate with Bluetooth. And, you know, you can tell, success, you have eggs. You can tell how old they are. I guess you can keep the stock rotated, a dozen eggs. I mean, a dozen eggs doesn't last a week in my house. This is not a problem that I had, you know, really thought very much about. I'm sure it works just great. I have questions about, you know, putting batteries in a thing in the fridge and stuff like that. But, like, yeah, finally, we have the sensor technology and the microcontrollers and Bluetooth Low Energy, and we can do a thing like this, and it's fantastic. All of this stuff is going to get made. Someone somewhere is going to have a Kickstarter, or that website Quirky, which is where this thing comes from, which is one of the most interesting things that you can do, is go on Quirky and see all the amazing dumb stuff that's there. It's better than Etsy. Worse. But how do you tell the difference between stuff like this and the really good stuff, the stuff that deserves to exist? So, the traditional engineering way of doing product development is bottom up. You start with a technology, and you work your way up to a product, and that's great. And it, like I say, it can work if you're way out on the bleeding edge of what's just barely possible. But it's less appropriate now. There is so much great tech out there that has been totally solved. We have this amazing toolbox of super abilities at our disposal. We have all of these roads that have been paved. Everything is easy. Web frameworks, game engines, Bluetooth LE, Wi-Fi, all of this stuff, microcontrollers, it's really, really easy. So the better way to approach product design with all of this stuff at our disposal is to turn it around, to start at the top with humans and to work our way down towards a workable product. Start with who we are, how we live, what's meaningful to us, and then define those technologies that enable products that can actually enhance our lives and actually add value and meaning. These are the things that actually deserve to exist. So I'm going to hit you with some slogans. The slogans are really good, and I'll go slow so you have time to write them down because they're very important. The first one is a terrible heresy at a lot of companies with a strong engineering culture. I won't mention the one where I used to work. The technology doesn't matter. Right? Of course it matters. This is what we do, isn't it? Well, it is a necessary condition. The Nest thermostat wouldn't work without Wi-Fi. But for a successful product, it's not sufficient. So I want to tell you a story. I used to work for a company called Intrigue Technologies, and we made Harmony Remote, and it was a really fun place. We were acquired by Logitech, and they hired a bunch of really smart user experience people. And we did a thing. The thing about the Harmony was it worked really, really well. It helped you control all your stuff with one button. The trouble was it was kind of complicated to set up. And so we did some anthropological studies, which was fascinating. I'd never even heard about this before. We found some volunteers who, for the price of a free $300 remote, let us into their homes, and we could watch them set it up. So I was there with one of the other software managers. I was a software manager myself at the time, and this guy was in charge of firmware. And we went to this fella's house with our notebooks, just like Jane Goodall watching the chimpanzees. It was amazing. We weren't allowed to help the guy. We could only observe. Yeah, you know, the non-interference, right? The prime directive. So, and it was horrible. It was one of the most humbling experiences of my life, because we were there for 3 hours watching this guy, and he wasn't a dummy. He was a sales manager, but still not a dummy. But he was able to set up his own Wi-Fi, and he was good with computers and understood all this stuff. Watched him fail for 3 hours to get this thing working. He called customer service. He tried everything he could, reset it a bunch of times, and failed. So finally, at the end, we said, okay, we helped him, and he loved it. But he said, you know, if he had gone to Future Shop and spent $300 on this thing, he would have returned it. And I'll never forget, when we were leaving this fella's house, I was holding the door open for the firmware manager guy, and he had this big smile on his face, and he was shaking his head, and he said, boy, you know, the firmware worked perfectly. And I said, what? He said, yeah, you know, apparently in the last build, you know, there had been a couple of really nasty bugs, and he had been sitting there. He had a very different experience from me. I just had nothing but, like, crushing shame. And he was sitting there very, very worried that one of these bad bugs was going to manifest. And I realized something. It's like a bolt of lightning hit me, and I thought, oh, my God. Imagine, all of you who run technical teams, development teams, that you could put something in their water or wave a magic wand that would have them execute perfectly. 0 defects, no bugs. Everything, perfect technical execution. You still might have a terrible failure on your hands if you don't think about the human side of things, if you don't have enough human-centered design, if you don't think about how people actually do stuff, you can fail completely. This was a big deal for me because I was a geek, and, you know, as a software manager, your days are like, what's your bug count? Are you going to hit schedule? What are the showstoppers and stuff like that? None of that mattered. It was amazing. So, the next thing I want to mention is that the very best products are meaningful. This is important. This is one of my favorite things in the world. Does anybody recognize this? Cool. It's a little bit hipster, so you guys, you know, probably will hear about it in a few months. This was produced by a friend of a dear friend of mine in London, and it's called the Goodnight Lamp. And here's what it does. You've got one house, which is a little bit bigger, and then a smaller house. And they both have cellular radios in them. And on top of the chimney on the big house, there's a button. And when you press the button, the big house lights up, and the little house lights up wherever it may be in the world. And that's it. That's all it does. It transmits, in other words, like for the engineer, one bit of information, on or off, which is fascinating. The cool part is the meaning that you attach to that bit. So the idea is, I'm a traveling dad, and I get lonesome. So, the girls would have one of these at home, and when they're off to bed, they might turn it on. It's a good time to call. I'm thinking of you. It's story time. Whatever it is that you want this bit to transmit, launch the missiles. It can do it. And what I love about it is that it doesn't impose anything on the users at all, but it allows them to attach whatever meaning that they choose to this one bit. It's absolutely wonderful. So this is enabled by technology, of course. It's impossible, in fact, without it. But it's about giving users another very special, very charming channel to communicate with each other. Absolutely wonderful. More of this, please. Okay, this one's really good. A prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. Maybe 10,000. You should not ever imagine that you can figure out any of this stuff a priori, before any experience. You'll never be able to just sit there in your comfortable chair by the fire and figure this stuff out like Descartes. You need experience. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. The spaceship out there is a really good example of this. We've been experimenting with physical installations. We want to build a game experience around this thing eventually, but we wanted first to bring it here to FITC and get a bunch of people through it so that we could find out, like, which parts of this are really fun. You know, is the patch game fun? Do people like throwing these big, heavy toggle switches? You know, do we need more LEDs? And how scary is the secret fog machine? Stuff like that. Public demos are the best way to do this. I'll tell you another story. I used to work at QNX, and QNX makes an operating system, and a lot of what they do is in automotive. So actually, it ships in more cars than all other OSs combined. So if you've got a navigation system, chances are it's running QNX. So I led the concept development group at QNX, which was another weird gig, because we made concept cars, and not the ones that you see, you know, at the car shows with the really cool spoilers and stuff on them. We focused on the electronics. So we did this project for CES about 3 years ago. It was a Porsche 911 convertible, which, you know, was a pretty cool purchase order to fill out. One Carrera S Cabriolet, black. And we did all kinds of crazy stuff to it. We put in a digital instrument cluster. We put in a really cool media player that could stream stuff from all over the place. We had a communication system, telephone call, that was stereo, full duplex, and 48 kilohertz bandwidth, so you could hear a flea fart on the other side of the call. It was an amazing experience. And towards the end of the project, one of the guys on the team had been playing around with NFC tags, you know, in near-field communication. And QNX, as they still are now, was a subsidiary of BlackBerry. So we all had these BlackBerry phones with NFC communication. And we were using them in the demo because the car talked to the phone and back and forth. And it was kind of troublesome for us to be pairing with Bluetooth all the time because we all had different phones. So one of the guys got really smart. He said, okay, I'm going to put the pairing information for the head unit on this NFC tag and just stick it underneath. And sure enough, you just had to get into the car, wave your phone at it, and you were paired, and everything worked. It took us 20 minutes. And we got a lot of press. Everybody came through, you know, Forbes and, you know, TechCrunch and Engadget, all these guys came through. And most of them, the headlines were things like, "Miracle car of the future has instant Bluetooth pairing." And I thought, really? We worked for months on some of this stuff, and it was really hard to do. And the thing that took us 20 minutes was the thing that people really latched onto. Mike Lazaridis got in the car, and he couldn't believe it. He was unpairing his phone and pairing it over and over again because it was just so miraculous. So you never know what's going to stick until you put it in front of people. Especially when you're working very closely on something like this, you can't see it anymore. When it's been this close to your face for months, you can't trust your own perspective on what's important because you're only going to measure it by how hard it was. It's the same old story about engaging with your users early on. This is what minimum viable products are supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about finding out what people actually want. And this is also part of why agile development, both in product and in software, sort of works. So here's another thing. This was interesting. So a few months ago, I had got some new sound sensors that work with Arduinos, and I wanted to try them out and do something. So I also had some motor controllers, and so I thought, okay, well, wouldn't it be cool to make a little box with a sound sensor in it and a motor with a piece of a drumstick? And so when you tap on the box listens, and after a couple seconds of silence, taps back exactly what you did. Now, I'm a drummer and also a software geek, so I took some pains to make sure that, you know, it tapped back exactly, sort of uncannily, exactly what you tapped. And the reactions to this were very interesting, and it was a great lesson for me because, I mean, this is the most friendly-looking box. It's pink and blue. It's got a friggin' happy face on it. But when it knocked back, the universal reaction was, "Oh my God, that's so creepy." One of the guys on the team, he said, this is a direct quote, "Send it back to hell." This was completely unpredictable to me. And just as an aside, there was something I think really interesting going on. You guys mostly know about the uncanny valley where, you know, if you've got a robot that sort of looks like a human, it's really creepy. If it doesn't look like a human at all, it's okay. I think it has as much to do with agency as it does to do with appearance. The box was doing something that boxes really shouldn't do, and it hinted at some sort of malevolent intelligence in it. And this was in the fall. This was really cool. This was just in October. And so someone came up with the idea. They said, you know, instead of a pink box with a happy face on it, you should put it in a coffin. Which is what I did. Yeah, I built a child-sized coffin. Yes, I did. And I put it in there. It was pretty cool. Scared a lot of kids. I live out in Carp in the country. And you had a lot of this. You know, they had a little sign on it that said knock. And the little kids would come and knock on it. And then so many of them just did this. With their eyes wide. Yeah, it was pretty awesome. So, so what is the upshot of all of this? What should you do? You should shut up and build it, basically. It's so easy these days. Everything is really, really easy. Websites, mobile apps, microcontrollers, Bluetooth, servos, all of this stuff is so simple that you have no excuse. And there is so much to be learned from even a really rough, quick and dirty prototype that if you're not building them and testing them in public, then you're going to suck in avoidable ways. Build it first, ask questions later. So we're entering what I think, what I hope, what should be a golden age of product design. There's going to be a lot of crappy stuff built, but I think there's going to be a lot of really wonderful, charming stuff built as well, because the technology is so easy. I mean, stuff that was really difficult 5 or 10 years ago, we now hand off to our high school intern, Jared. He's here. We call him Sparky. And it's awesome. It was funny. I was talking to him one day, and he was doing all this crazy stuff. I said, man, you know, you should have been here 20 years ago. This was all really hard, and it's just like Lego now. It's just as easy as Lego. He said, no, it's even easier. Yeah, and it's true. I mean, you know, I've been doing stuff on microprocessors for 30 years now. I've been building products for more than a decade. And with all of the tools we have, the whole maker revolution has been fantastic. And what has accelerated it is that the makers are making things to help other makers make things now, and it's starting to feed back on itself. The whole Arduino thing is just great. Like, microcontrollers used to be really tricky. You had to code everything in C, you had to know how a computer worked. You had these weird little programmers, and it was hard. Arduinos now are just so easy, and everything plugs into them. If you need Bluetooth, if you need any kind of sensor or controller, it's all there. And even that's accelerating. There's little tiny ones now with Bluetooth integrated that'll run on a coin cell for months. So anything is possible. It's just so easy to do. If you needed a piece of plastic 5 years ago in a particular shape, you pretty much had to sit on the porch with a glass of lemonade and whittle the thing. And that was it. And now, you know, we've got all these 3D printers, and they're slow and they're crappy. They're kind of like dot matrix printers were in 1983. You know, you have to babysit them. They jam all the time. They're noisy and they're slow. But they won't be for long. Everything is just is moving so quickly. It's fantastic. So I wanted to share one last thought with you. I have an interest in philosophy, and I really like Wittgenstein. He's hard to read, but he's worth it. And he said a thing once about the nature of philosophy that I'm totally appropriating from him. He said that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of our language. And what he meant was that a lot of these things, the classic problems of philosophy, aren't really problems at all. The problem of other minds. How can I tell that you are a minded being with thoughts and experiences just like me? You know, I don't have access to your brain or to your, your senses or your experience, so it's hard. I need to prove it. I can't prove it. It's a big problem of epistemology. Wittgenstein said all that was bullshit, and we should not pay attention to these false problems. And I think it applies in product design as well. So that you can say good product design is a battle against the bewitchment of our creativity by means of our technology. In other words, start with humans first, and then let the technology follow. Thank you very much. Questions? I can't see. Awesome. All right, enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the conference. Thanks again.